Hello, folks. We're gonna turn the microphone on here. We're gonna get started here now for the afternoon session. Welcome, everyone. Just give everyone a moment to settle into their seats and get ready for what's coming. What's coming is interesting. We have had many interesting panels, as those who have been here will know, and this afternoon we continue with that. So this session this afternoon is organized under the theme of Living Under Threat in Labrador. We have 4 speakers. There are 5 actually. 2 of them are together as a unit, and they are Stig Balland and Lennart Elfgren. We'll begin with them. I'll just say a word about their presentation first. Its format is slightly unusual and require a little bit of explanation. The format is unusual because they will be presenting a pre-recorded video, which we'll play now in a moment, and Stig and Lennart will be available online through the comments section to answer questions from the audience after the presentation, after everyone's presentation. So I'd just like to say a word first about Lennart Elfgren and Stig Bernander, who will be presenting this video presentation. And as soon as I find my notes, I will get back to you with them. Stig Balland and Lennart Elfgren have both been doing research on the North Spur, an arm of the bank, of the dam, which has been the subject of some controversy about its stability and the geophysical formation on which it is built. Stig Balland is a civil engineer and has designed or been engaged in major civil engineering work such as bridges, dams, harbors, tunnels, dry docks, offshore structures, buildings, underground storages, and water supply structures in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Poland, Monaco, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, India, Sri Lanka, and Zimbabwe. So he has been around. Lennart Elfgren is a civil engineer who returned to the University of Luleå, I hope I'm saying that right, in Sweden as full professor in 1983, and has served as department head and dean of the Faculty of Engineering and Sciences there since. He has published more than 300 papers and reports. Phenomenal. Now I will say a little bit about their research and then I'll let their video get underway. Some of you are already familiar with their research. A very little short story to provide some context. In 2014, Cabot Martin invited Stig Balland to investigate the stability, or to look into the stability of the North Spur and his concerns about the glacial-marine clays on which it is built, which some geophysical engineers, I'm not one, believe are subject to deformation when subjected to pressure, such as a dam. Stig Balland did research on it and had reason to believe that there were questions to be raised about the stability of the North Spur, and that the existing science from SNL Javelin that Nalcor had based the structure on was insufficient and was based on old scientific methods that had been shown to be insufficient to address the technical complexity of the North Spur. So Bernander presented these results, or brought these results to SNL Javelin and Nalcor and asked them to look into it. And they thought that the research was significant enough to invite a peer review panel to look into it. And in February of this year, they released the Geotechnical Peer Review Panel report on the research, on their research and on their questions and concerns about the stability of the dam. And the result of that report was really that his concerns were insignificant, or that the old science, this would be more accurate to say, that the old science was sufficient to understand the problem that they were presenting. If you read the report, you will, in the introduction to the report, you'll come across this. The assessment was restricted to a review of the original research conducted by SNL Javelin Incorporated, which Nalcor had followed. Further, the GRP report assessment clearly states that the GRPR, I'm saying that wrong, I'm sorry, has not performed any calculation to verify the accuracy, completeness, or validity of the results obtained by SLI. The opinion of the GRP is based solely on a review of available data and on the concepts and methods used by SLI and the client to assess stability issues at the North Spur. I don't know if you can follow what I'm saying there, but essentially what they say in the introduction to the report is that they did not do any new science or gather any new information or use any new methods. They went back and verified the existing science that was there before. So Stig Balland and Lennart Elfgren are providing a response to the report on their research in the form of a video that we'll now play. They will be available for questions afterwards. Okay? After that, we will have 3 other presentations. Emily Philpott, who has been doing research in the Lake Belleville area, Kyla Bruff, and Roberta Benefiel. We'll begin now with Lennart and Stig's video presentation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lennart Elfgren, and I'm a senior professor at Luleå University of Technology. This presentation was prepared in collaboration with Stig Balland, who has been engaged and designed major civil engineering works, working together with Skanska, a major Swedish contractor. He has also been engaged as an adjunct professor at Luleå University of Technology. During the last 40 years, he has worked with the analysis of landslides. We are happy to share this pre-recorded presentation with you, and I hope that at the end I will be able to be online and answer any questions you might have. The contents of the presentation is we start with a background and discuss possible instability of the North Spur, reports written by Stig Balland, a report written by a geotechnical peer review panel, and finally the conclusions. And the main conclusion we have is that the stability of the North Spur is not established. It may very well fall down, and there has been to be a proper investigation of the stability. And if it's not stable, it has to be stabilized. Here is a short video clip where Stig Balland and I are discussing. He was approached by Cabot Martin when he was at a landslide workshop in Quebec in 2013. And Cabot Martin asked him if he wanted to look into the stability of the North Spur. And he said that that might be an interesting thing to do. So the next year he went there. Here we see a picture of the Ice Age and the last glaciation 10,000 years ago, when we had a 3 to 4 kilometer thick ice layer that pressed down the surface of the Earth. And you can see to the right there is Canada and North America, and I also marked Muskrat Falls. And if you look to the left, there is Europe and Asia, and there is also Luleå marked at the upper part of Sweden. And here you can see what part that were ice covered during the summer and during the winter. And we had a thick ice layer both in Scandinavia and in Labrador. And Muskrat Falls was formed by this ice age. And as you know, the idea to build a power plant has been around for a long time. And the prerequisites for this building is that the soil in Labrador, it was deposited in the sea after the last ice age, and the Earth's surface has then rebounded above the sea level. And then the Churchill River has successively eroded its way down, and the slopes are highly susceptible to landslides. And the North Spur is a ridge composed of many layers of silty sands and lean, silty, sandy clays. And these soils, they are vulnerable to softening and liquefaction when they are disturbed. Here is a picture of a slide in 2014 on the north bank of Lower Churchill River, midway between Muskrat Falls and Goose Bay. And you can see the river in the front and how the slide has worked itself backwards, upwards into the slope of the river, the dam bank, the river bank. Here is another picture from 2010 from Edward Island, where we had a slide midway between Muskrat Falls and Gull Island. And also here you can see the river in the front and how the landslide has worked itself way upwards into the dam bank gradually, a progressive slide. Here a picture from October 2014 when Stig Balland visited the North Spur. And here you can also see the appearance of the soil. It looks rather sandy and silty, and there may be some clay into it too. This is the problem. Here is an aerial view of the Muskrat Falls and the North Spur. And what we fear can happen here is that when the water rises in the dam, then there will be a major pressure indicated by the red arrows here on the North Spur. And if the soil in the spur isn't strong enough, it may well happen that all the spur slides down into the right end downstream area of the river. There are two types of progressive failures. The first one, A, on the top of the picture, is called a flow slide or a backward slide or an upward progressive slide. And they are common in Canada and in the Churchill River Valley. And they start at the right where the river erodes into the river bank. And then there can be that a part of the bank will become unstable and slides down into the river. Then the next part of the dam bank, river bank, will be unstable. And there can be successive slides, as you see here in the picture. The other kind of progressive failure is B in the bottom of the figure. It's called forward or downhill progressive. It's not so common in Canada, it's very common in Scandinavia. And here you see that the failure starts to the left in the top of the slope, and then it works its way downward. There it can be initiated by a load that hasn't been there before, for example, a temporary filling, piling, or as in our case, the rising water of the dam that gives a very high horizontal force. And if the soil along the failure surface cannot take this force, then the soil will fail and it will start to slide. And in this case, it starts in the upper part where the force is active. And if the soil cannot take it, then the failure progresses successively downwards to the other end. These pictures are taken from an article from a paper by Adrian Lucas from 2011 from the Canadian Geotechnical Journal. There is also another paper written by Stig Balland from 2016 on downhill progressive landslides, and we will now see a video abstract of it.
We have summarized it in a doctoral thesis, and now it's also summarized in this paper.
Yes.
Can you highlight the most important conclusion in the paper?
Progressive landslide analysis explains how and why it can actually happen that a long natural slope which has remained stable for centuries or even millennia can be destabilized by seemingly small additional loads from, for instance, local fills, local vibratory or piling activity. Analysis also clearly explains why downhill landslides tend to spread over vast areas of more or less horizontal ground beyond the foot of the slope, showing that already before passive resistance is reached, a failure surface measuring hundreds of meters may have developed deep under the surface of the level ground. The finite difference model has been applied to a number of Scandinavian landslides and at least one in Canada. In the article, 3 case studies are briefly discussed. Briefly speaking, the model is a finite difference approach where the downhill axial deformation due to the additional load is maintained compatible all the time with deviatory deformations in the highly sheared zone near the failure surface. Software and spreadsheets are introduced as well as recent developments. Progressive failure analysis invalidates the use of classic limit equilibrium approach in long slopes with sensitive plane.
Here you see photos of the co-authors of the paper. There are Anders Bullingsjö, Anders Kyla, Benefiel, Roland Busch, and Knutson, Jan Olofsson, and myself. Here is a slide where you can see the consistency of the soil. It was prepared by Cabot Martin, and he made a companion of lots of geotechnical data, and it can be found on the web on the link that is given here. So, as I mentioned, Stig Balland was approached in 2013 by Cabot Martin, and he went to visit Churchill River in October 2014, and he made visit by air, car, boat, as well as on foot. And he wrote reports on the stability of the North Spur during the following years. He also initiated a Master of Science thesis by Robert Curie in 2017, which was also presented at the workshop in Trondheim. And all the reports may be downloaded from this link. Here is the first report written in 2015 after his first visit. And then he made some further comments on that and on the later reports. Then in 2016, he made a third report where he really looked into the problems, and he also proposed some methods to stabilize the ridge if it wasn't good enough as it was. Then in 2017, we have here the thesis, the master thesis by Robert Curie, which was presented at a workshop in Trondheim. And here we have some posters from this workshop. Then last year, Stig Balland wrote a summing up of the North Spur issues, and then he and me summarized all the reports in this technical report on the University of Technology. And then this summer, we prepare this response and comments to the Geotechnical Peer Review panel. And in this report, we also have a preface by two professors in soil mechanics and foundation engineering in Sweden, Jan Laue and Sven Knutsson. There are two methods for analysis of slides, and they will be illustrated here. But if we start at the upper right corner, you can see there is originally a rectangle, and then it's forced by two shearing forces, two green arrows at the top and bottom, and these deforms the rectangle, so it turns into a ellipsoid. No, well, it turns into a skew figure where you see the shear forces and the deformation gamma to the vertical axis. And in the diagram in the center, you can see the relationship between these shear forces tau on the vertical axis and the deformation on the horizontal axis. And if we start at 0 in the lower left corner, the relationship in the beginning is straight, it's linear, then it starts to curve, it's a maximum about 30 kilopascal, and then it starts to soften. It can take lesser and lesser stresses the more it's deformed. And finally it gets a residual value that here is about half the maximum value, but it can also be much lower if it is a weak soil. So this is the softening behavior. Then the traditional limit equilibrium method, LEM, used by Nalker-Lavalin, they assumes the strengths to remain constant after deformation. That is the blue dotted line. And that is the same that is used when you are studying metals. That is an ideal plastic behavior, and it's very easy to make calculations because they are linear. But now then it has been found that you can take into consideration the softening behavior. You get quite other results, and that is the red line, and that is how it should be done nowadays. Here is a slide showing the variation of the soil properties in the North Spur. And again, we have the stresses tau at the vertical axis, and we have a blue curve, which is a good soil, which has a maximum capacity of about 135 kilopascal. And then the residual value can be some 62.5 or 3.75 kilopascal. But then there are also weak soils, the red one. And you see that it's only 1/3 to 1/4 of the good soil. And the problem is that there are material with these properties in the North Ridge, according to the investigations that Nalker-Lavalin has made. And if we find a lens with these properties, which is in a critical section, then it may start a failure. So here is an overview of the North Spur from 2017. It's upstream, and you can see the work that has been done to prevent erosion on the North Spur slopes, and that is to prevent these backward slopes, this failure that progressively eats itself into the slope. Here is a section through this upstream section of the ridge, and you can see it in the left end, in the bottom there, you can see the present level of the water. It's about 17 meters according to the scale that is to the right of the picture. Then the water will rise due to the dam, and it will rise to 39 meters, and that will mean an increase of 22 meters. And that will cause a major horizontal load on the ridge, which is indicated by the blue triangle to the left, and also by the thick red arrow marked with an N. That is the load that the ridge now has to take when the water is there. And the question is, how can the ridge take up this load? And we have studied different slip surfaces, and one of them is indicated with red dotted line, and the slip surface is inclined, so it goes down to the water level downstream of the ridge. And you can see that there are green small arrows indicating the shear stress that the soil may take under the slip surface. And if the concentrated load N is so large that these green stresses there cannot take up the force, then the slide will fail there and it will start to subside. And then the force must be taken further down the slope, and then the shear forces there will be increased. And if we have a lens with weak material in this slip surface, then we will have a failure. And then the failure will progressive further down, and then it will end up everything in the downstream area of the river. So here is another picture of this erosion protection work on the upstream side, and a possible downstream progressive failures indicated with the red arrow. If we look at the ridge from downstream, we see here that there's a lot of work being done to protect the ridge from erosion and to protect it from backward slides that eat themselves backwards into the slope. And the Nalco leveling has made a lot of work to protect the ridge from this kind of erosion. But the kind of progressive forward, downward failure that we are talking about here, they haven't done anything for them to prevent. So they appointed a geotechnical peer review panel to look into and discuss the findings that Stig Balland has written about in his reports. And in the introduction to their report, they say that it is based on information made available to the geotechnical peer review panel by SNC Lavalin and the client. The GPRP has not performed any calculation by themselves, not anything, in order to verify the accuracy, completeness, or validity of the results obtained by the SLI. So, the opinion of the geotechnical peer review panel is solely based on the review of data made available to them and concept and methods made available to them by SNA and the client. So, we think that the aim and scope of this geotechnical peer review panel report seem to have been to just justify that Nalco leveling has made an acceptable job. However, Nalco leveling has only used old standard methods and not used the methods that had been derived during the last 50 years. And that is very human, that to rely on old results, but in a case like this, you have to look at what is happening, how can you better understand a slide like this. And finally, the geotechnical peer review panel only discusses Stig Balland's earlier reports and not the latest ones. So our response to and comments on the GPRP report is that it does not investigate the most critical failure surface. And it does not give any information on the deformation properties of the soils. So it cannot properly evaluate the stability of the nose spur, because you have to know the deformation properties to be able to make any analysis that is worth the name. And our investigative calculations, where we had assumed deformation properties from other landslides, indicate a safety that is less than 1. That is, according to them, the nose spur will fail. So our final conclusion is that as neither Nalco Lavalin nor the GPRP has managed to make a proper failure analysis, an independent committee of experts appointed by government should analyze the stability of the nose spur. And if they should find that the stability is not good enough, Stig Balland has proposed 2 means to stabilize it: by compacting it or by injecting it with the injection grout. And with that, I conclude this presentation, and I hope to be able to be with you online to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lennart and Stig, wherever you are out there. We will join you soon. Our next speaker is Roberta Frampton Benefiel. She is co-founder and Riverkeeper for Grand Riverkeeper Labrador. She is a member of, that is a New York-based Waterkeeper Alliance. Roberta has been involved with Labrador citizens concerned about the fate of the Grand, aka Churchill River, since 1998. And I believe also was involved with Cabot Martin and Stig Bernander in the events that were described in the previous video, correct? So thank you, Roberta.
I have to have all my devices so that I feel safe, okay? I would like to say about Dr. Bernander's and Dr. Elfgren's presentation that the review panel was mostly made up of people that Nalcor paid. In fact, Nalcor paid all of them as far as we know. I'd just like to let you know that all of this work that Dr. Bernander and Lennart Elfgren have done for Grand Riverkeeper and for Muskrat Falls Coalition has all been done for free. And I'd also like to tell you that I mentioned on a trip on the North Spur to Gilbert Bennett that, you know, he continued to say that the North Spur is safe, and that I said, but Gilbert, we have documentation that's telling us different, that is explaining that there are new ways to study. And Dr. Bernander says you haven't used the newest methods. And he said, you know, our scientists have done the work. And I said, but your scientists are biased because they've been paid by you. Why would they say something different when they know they'll probably never get another job from you? And he said, well, Bernander is biased too. So I just want to point out that Dr. Bernander's biases, as far as it goes for our thoughts, is that he did the work because he's worried, because we're worried about what will happen on the North Spur. So I have to pull up this document here real quick. No, I don't need to. I can see it up here, sure. So I couldn't come up with a whole lot of beautiful pictures, and I didn't need to because Denise had them. And actually, I'm not very technical, so it took me a while this morning to even get these two pictures up there. So here we are. This is the way it used to be. And of course, Denise told you all about it this morning. So if you could change slides, please. So just an outline of what I thought I'd talk about, tell you a little bit about the Friends of Grand River. That's how we started. A group of concerned citizens got together. Then we became associated with the Waterkeeper Alliance in 2005. We incorporated federally, and our connection through Cabot Martin with Stig Balland, and Dr. Bernander came and we took him up in boat, and a couple of the pictures that Denise showed this morning, we actually got out on those clay deposits in the river. And there's a YouTube video that John Parsons did, and you can watch me standing there going like this with my feet, and within seconds my feet are sinking in up to my ankles in mud. And that's what just came out of the riverbank just below Muskrat Falls. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Northeast Megadams Resistance Group, and then I'll talk about our joint review panel and inquiry submissions. I'll talk about the global issues of mega hydro, and then a conclusion about where do we go from here. So this is I'm going to take this off so I can walk back and see this a little bit better. This is a quote I got from online. It's an environmental justice organization of Australia. They said, liberal standing promotes environmental protection and the rule of law. Where community groups or individuals are allowed to enforce public interest environmental protection, the rule of law is strengthened. Review of governmental decision is a fundamental safeguard against government, specifically the exclusive arm of government acting beyond its power, that is to say, unlawfully, or making poor or unaccountable decisions. And if you have time to write down that crazy link there. I'd be happy to provide it if you want to look at it. But this was a group that apparently in Australia, they had standing to be able to request a judicial review of any environmental issues that citizens were able to do this. And the new government of the day was about to destroy that and take it away. And so this organization was granted standing to argue against that. So my statement at the bottom is empowering citizens is a fundamental aspect of democracy. But that empowerment is hard won, as we all know, and many of us in the activist department know, and must involve citizens from a grassroots perspective, including the silent majority, which I said yesterday, we do really have to find a way to reach out to the silent majority. Go ahead. Sure. So just a little bit about the Joint Review Panel and the inquiry submissions, just to let you know that for years we've been saying what we said here today and yesterday. We talked about the effects beyond the mouth of the river, the erosion, the sediment, the nutrients held back behind the dams. We talked about the justification for the project. We said it's not justified in environmental terms. The panel said it's not justified in economic or environmental terms. The alternatives weren't properly studied. The consultation was sorely lacking. We had invited only people to look at the habitat, fish habitat compensation plan, invited only people to look at the methyl mercury plan, not public, just invited guests. We presented on the red wine endangered caribou, which, by the way, according to NALCOR's most recent published document in 2017, there are only 20 animals left in the red wine herd. We haven't found the 2018 one yet, so we're not sure how that is. We talked extensively about the methyl mercury and many, many more issues. And we started looking at this in 1998, back when, you know, Bouchard and Tobin had just finished making their statements and deciding they were going to dam the river. And we said, well, we better get organized, we better learn. And we tried to do that. So go ahead, Carrie. Just really quickly, the North Spur Natural Dam. I'm not going to go through all of those because you just heard what Dr. Bernander said. We worry that the North Spur has not been studied properly. We've said it over and over again. We want them to do what Dr. Bernander says because we believe Dr. Bernander is saying that not because he's being paid, but because he's concerned, because he thinks there's a possibility that that dam could fail. If it fails, then the lower portion of Happy Valley Goose Bay will go underwater, and Denise had a map in her presentation this morning, and Mud Lake will disappear. And Mud Lake's already been flooded with about 6 feet of water. Then there's the S&C Lavalin risk report that came up. Someone mentioned that this morning, and we want to ask, you know, did Ed Martin refuse to accept it? Why did S&C Lavalin not release it before 2017? What's going on with that? They held on to this report from 2013 to 2017, and then they released it and said, oh, well, we tried to give it to Ed Martin, but he wouldn't accept it. And now, of course, there's the he said, she said, who gave it to who and who didn't give it to who and whatever. So we still don't have an evacuation plan for Mud Lake. It is impossible to evacuate Mud Lake as far as they're concerned. I had a chat with Craig Chalk in Mud Lake not long before I left, and because I wanted to update and see what was happening. He said, well, they're doing some work. They're flying around and trying to figure out what the height of the water will be in case of a flood. So they're doing, you know, the flood risk thing. And I said, but what about an evacuation plan to get you out of there if the North Spur was to fail, or if either one of the dams was to fail? They have less than 2 hours to move out. And he said, there is no way, Roberta. We can't, nobody can see that there's a way other than they want to put a road in, and we don't want to live like that. We go to bed at night and leave our keys in our snow machines and leave our doors open. We don't want to live any other way. We don't want a road. So that's really, it's a cultural destruction of the community of Mud Lake. So are they expendable for the sake of a Muskrat Falls hydro project? Go ahead. Okay, and then, back to the Harvard study, another question about people being expendable. People who continue to eat country food will have mercury increases in their body up to 15%, 1,500%, sorry. Even the average person who continues to eat country food on a semi-regular basis can have methylmercury increased up to 400%. Stan Marshall said on the news one time, or I can't remember exactly which media it was in, but he said, I don't know what the problem is. Nobody died from the upper Churchill. Well, it shows an ignorance of Stan Marshall about exactly what methylmercury does do in the body. It's a neurotoxin. We could have children in school not able to learn their ABCs because their mother has been eating fish out of that river ever since it was dammed in the 1960s. He just doesn't understand, and he makes statements like that out in the open. So contaminating the wild food that thousands of Labrador Inuit rely on and exposing hundreds of Inuit to methylmercury levels that exceed Health Canada's guidelines for generations. That's on the Make Muskrat Right website. If you're interested in understanding what all Harvard had to say about the methylmercury, that's the place to find most of the information. Inuit culture, they said, is inextricably connected to the wild food. So are people and their culture expendable for a hydro project? And especially for this hydro project. Go ahead. So on the global issues of large hydro, I wanted to talk a little bit, and I think I skipped that, a little bit about our involvement with the Northeast Megadam group. Last year in January, I believe it was, year before last in January, there was a forum in Goose Bay on Muskrat Falls, and we had some visitors from Antioch University. One of those professors, her name is Alicia Maltz. She checked in with me in May of 2016, 2017. My years are all confused. I think it was 2017. And said, come to Antioch. That was the heading in her email. You have to come to Antioch. And I thought, oh, okay. So they offered some money for me to go down and speak with the professors at Antioch University. And I thought, if I go down to the Northeast, I want to talk to more than just one group of people. And then I'm saying all this just to explain to you how networking really works and how we have to reach out to people whenever we find an ear for some of this, okay? So in between all this, Justin Brake had done some stories about the Labrador land protectors and their resistance to the project. And a woman named Meg Sheehan, an environmental lawyer from Boston, reached out to him and said, who can I talk to at Labrador Land Protectors or Grand River Keeper? And he put her in touch with me. And she called and she said, we would like for someone to come to Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts in November for Thanksgiving. And apparently at Plymouth Rock, the Aboriginal people every year for many, many years have had what they call a day of mourning instead of a Thanksgiving, because they don't believe that that's the first Thanksgiving, that people were having Thanksgiving meetings. Aboriginal people were having Thanksgiving long before the pilgrims showed up. So I thought, okay. So I called Meg and we got Alicia Maltz. And then we had another friend named Pete Antos Ketchum who lives in Vermont. And we picked up the phone and called Pete. And before you know it, we had about $4 million, oh, I wish, $4,000 in the bank, or promised. And I said, okay, so we're going to see how many people we can reach out to. Well, I think it was 5 weeks, 5.5 weeks. Denise, help me if I'm off the mark here. In that 5.5 weeks, with a 1998, what is my truck? Nissan. A 1998 Nissan Frontier. We crisscrossed the Northeast United States from Vermont to New Hampshire to Connecticut to New York City and Albany and Maine and Massachusetts, and we talked to 15 different groups, and we have 20 groups throughout the Northeast United States who are on side and who have agreed to become the Northeast or the North American Mega Dam Resistance Alliance. And the reason they're involved, and this is really strange, you find your friends in a lot of weird places, because the reason they're involved is because there are, I'll name a few if I can read what I wrote this morning, power lines that are proposed to go down into New Hampshire, through Vermont, through Maine, through the Chippy or the Champlain Hudson Power Express, to bring power from the border of Canada, from Hydro-Quebec, and from the Churchill Falls project, because of course Hydro-Quebec owns all of the power except for a few hundred megawatts from the Churchill Falls project. So at any given time, whatever power is running through those lines could be coming from Labrador. So all of these power lines are proposed to go into these states, and these are, you know, well-intentioned academic people, and they're saying, but that's not renewable energy. That's not the real renewables. And not only that, why would we give all our money to Hydro-Quebec for power to come from 1,000 miles away when we need that money here in our home state to provide jobs, good, clean jobs, and good, real renewables, less damaging than the hydro projects. So we made a good fit. I talked about what the problems were up here, and I mean, everybody's talked about them. There's no need for me to get any deeper into them, but the people down there were like, I don't believe this. I don't believe one guy said to me, I always thought hydro was just the be all and end all of renewable energy. And of course, that's the message we got to get out. It's definitely not the be all and end all. There's not a thing that humans do in this world that don't cause some kind of environmental damage. What we got to do is make choices about how damaging we're going to be with our developments and with what the things we do. So globally, then, because of this involvement with the Northeast megadams, and by the way, we meet by phone every 2 weeks on a Tuesday in the afternoon. And if anybody's interested in getting involved with that group, I'd be happy to pass on information. And you're more than welcome to get in on the calls to hear what some of the issues are down there. And we give them an update, and they give us an update. And just about 2 weeks ago, we had an update from the Sierra Club National in the United States, which is like a big issue for us, that they oppose any new hydro projects and mega hydro. So slowly but surely over time, and I mean, when I say over time, I'm talking it's like 1998 till now, right? Over time, but this is now starting to catch on. And what we need is for people to start getting involved in this kind of stuff and get those silent majority folks somehow involved, in even if it's in the smallest way. Get them involved in what's happening. So I just want to show you or mention some things that came out in an article. So one of the projects that's proposed to go into the United States from Quebec is called the oh my, now I'm going to forget the name of it. Anyway, it's coming from Quebec, and it's by the Central Maine Energy Department is putting out a call for anyone that wants to have comments on the environmental impacts of this power line. The power line would come from the border of Canada down through Maine to go through to Massachusetts, to go into that area where we had our meeting with the Aboriginals in Plymouth Rock. The power, I guess there's I think there's a nuclear plant that they're trying to close down or are going to close down. And so this power will go through Maine and destroy all of that areas of beautiful, pristine wilderness that Mainers are so proud of, and go in, and not 1 kilowatt will go into anyone's home in Maine or any business. It's going all to Massachusetts. So this one fellow, I can't pronounce his last name. His name is Stephen M. Kasprzak, Kasperzak. He wrote into the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection and the Maine Board of Environmental Protection, and he's talking about this particular line going through his land. And I'm just going to go over a few of the things. There's a paper that I did get a copy of called Recent Trends and Variability in River Discharges Across Northern Canada, and it's by someone named Derry et al. Now, this fellow Derry apparently is a well-known scientist, because I picked up the phone and called Joel Heath. And I don't know if any of you know Dr. Joel Heath. He's right here in St. John's. His claim to fame in my book is People of a Feather. He's working up in the Belcher Islands, and his science, the work that he's done over the last 8 or 9 years, is talking about how the hydro projects in the James Bay area, they are releasing fresh water during the winter, when normally it would be released during the summer, and it's affecting the ice conditions for the eider ducks. The eider ducks are freezing. They don't have open water anymore, because fresh water, of course, freezes faster than salt water. I invite you to go online to the Arctic Eider Society, and there are a few trailers for that documentary. And I tell you, if you think Denise made you cry this morning, you're in for another tear or two, because that documentary will make you think twice about what hydro is doing. So I went to New York actually with Joel on the 2 weeks that his documentary was shown in New York City. And we talked about it a few times, and he said, you know, there's something else going on up there, and it's affecting the Labrador Current, but I just don't have time to get into that right now, because I'm doing so much work here and there with this eider duck thing. And that stuck in my mind, of course, you know, thinking about anything that had to do with Labrador. And the Labrador Current actually affects our, not just our climate, it affects the climate of Greenland and Newfoundland and all down the coast. So he did not get into that, but he did say he is looking into it. Now, this particular document that I have here from this Dr. or Stephen Kasperzak, that awakened the idea in me about the Labrador Current and what Joel Heath had said 2 or 3 years ago. So he said, in the ocean waters of Newfoundland, Labrador, and Maine, the fisheries are being starved to death. I'm just picking little pieces out of this. I'm happy to pass it on to anybody that wants it. The proliferation of large reservoir hydroelectric dams by Hydro-Quebec over the last 50 years never would have been allowed in Maine for the following reasons. And then he goes into all of the main environmental reasons. He says, I have listed below the observations which support each of the claims made above, and it would be the height of hypocrisy for Maine DEP to issue a permit for this corridor or transmission line and reward the bad behavior of Hydro-Quebec. This is the part that really got me. Half of the Gulf of Maine's ecosystem lies in Canada, where much of the water feeding the Gulf and affecting its temperature was written by Colin Woodward. It comes from Canada, of course. Climate of Fear, marine researchers are muzzled in Canada. That's another document he related. If Quebec's reservoir hydroelectric facilities are so good for the Gulf of Maine's ecosystems, why are Canadian researchers being muzzled? It is time to recognize that Quebec Hydro's reservoir hydroelectric facilities are a key regional driver in the unprecedented decline in the Gulf of Maine's fisheries, as well as contributing to the warming of the Gulf waters. Then he goes on to say, Quebec Hydro's reservoir facilities have eliminated the spring freshet on these rivers by capturing and storing the spring runoff, which is exactly what Joel Heath said. In other words, holding back clean water laden with dissolved oxygen was polluting downstream water, which did not have enough dissolved oxygen to support the river's fisheries and aquatic life. Quebec Hydro's reduction of spring and summer outflows is polluting Hudson Bay, the Labrador Sea, and the Gulf of Maine by depriving the silica-encased diatom phytoplankton population of its much needed dissolved silica during its growing season. The Gulf of Maine's cod catch was only 79,000 pounds in 2017, compared to 21 million pounds in 1991. Conservationists, fishermen, and the government are all concerned about a huge decline of up to 70% in the capelin population off the coasts of Newfoundland and Labrador. Diatoms are responsible for an estimated 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide transference from the atmosphere to the ocean. The countries who are the biggest producers of hydroelectricity are warming their nearby oceans. The Gulf of Maine and the South China Sea are two areas in the global ocean which are warming the fastest, and they are located next to the two largest producers of hydroelectricity in the world. The number one is China, and the number two is us, Canada. Okay, sorry. So I just want to make sure there's not something really, really important I have to get to. And then I'll finish up. Okay, so just in the end, in their conclusion, they say, the proliferation of reservoir hydroelectric facilities in Quebec's major rivers has greatly altered the seasonal timing of silica-laden freshwater qualities delivered to the Hudson Bay, Labrador Sea, and eventually to the Gulf of Maine. The diatom plankton ecosystems have not evolved to be starved of nutrients in the spring and summer, and then fed nutrients under lower light and temperature conditions in late fall. As a result, diatom population is adversely affected, and the rest of the food chain. And I don't remember who quoted it or who said it, but someone said it's kind of like watering your garden in the dead of winter. So that is the area that I think that we need to move on to, is to look at, besides the fact that, as I said this morning, that you know, the construction company is up there right now resurfacing the road or the airstrip for Gull Island. So if people want to get involved, now is the time to get involved about Gull Island. They already have the environmental assessment. That's done. They'll call that finished. It was part of the Lower Churchill project. So they have a go-ahead on the environmental assessment process. So let's get involved now. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Roberta. Our next speaker now is Emily Philpott. Emily Philpott recently completed her MA in International Development Studies at York University, but so what? She did her BA at MUN, and we taught her everything she knows. At York University, where she studied local people's perceptions and experiences around the impact of Muskrat Falls in central Labrador, including a focus on notions of well-being and resistance. So welcome, Emily.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to adjust this. Thank you, Roberta. That was wonderful. I'm sorry I had to step out for a minute while you were talking. I've got a bit of a cold and I had to do a last minute. Anyway, you don't need to know. So hi, everyone. My name is Emily. I'm originally from Corner Brook. As Stephen said, I just finished my master's at York University. I went to MUN for my undergrad. And I'm currently living in Happy Valley Goose Bay. I went there for my fieldwork last summer. I loved it so much. I keep finding excuses to come back. So that's where I live now. The title of my thesis is Health, History, and Identity, Understanding Resistance to the Muskrat Falls Project through Local Perceptions and Experiences in Central Labrador. It's a bit of a mouthful. My supervisor likes to make fun of me for having terrible titles, so that's the shortest one I could get. And so basically I wanted to just better understand how people in Labrador felt about Muskrat Falls, how they experience it, what meaning it has in their lives. And I thought the best way to do this was to sort of understand their perception, so both how they understand the dam and what it means for their environment, and also their experiences. And by experiences, I mean both the individual, but also the collective and sort of historical experiences around development in Central Labrador and how that plays into how they understand that the dam is going to influence their lives and also resistance against the project. And then also to know, what does all this mean for the well-being of the community? Like Neria, I'm in development studies, so we like to ask questions about, what is a good society? What does development mean anyway? And how can we work towards better societies that are good for the people that live in them based on those people's terms? So I guess well-being is kind of my way of looking at development or a good society in that regard. And I wanted to do it by talking to the people who live most closely to the project, who are the most directly affected. So what I did is I did semi-structured interviews with 17 people living in Upper Lake Melville or Central Labrador in the communities of Happy Valley Goose Bay, Northwest River, and Mud Lake. About half the people I interviewed were people who identified as land protectors or as members of the Grand River Keeper, people who were actively involved in the resistance during the fieldwork period. And the other, which I should say was about May to October of 2017. And the other half were more general members of the community. Some of them had attended the massive protests in October 2016 in solidarity, but they were typically people who were a little bit less visible in the community in terms of actively opposing the project or certain aspects of the project. And that's because I really wanted to understand how these land protectors were being impacted in their perspective, but I also wanted to see how maybe that was similar or dissimilar to people in the community. And I found that no matter who I talked to, there were a lot of very similar themes. Themes that keep coming up a lot, that came up in Jessica's research this morning, came up in my research. And so I was able to capture a lot of very diverse perspectives, but it's interesting how even amongst those perspectives, I had people aged 19 to 89, I had students, I had elders, I had business people, I had a little bit of everyone, how there were still similar narratives and themes that kind of came up throughout. And I also included participatory observation. So basically, I wasn't only informing my work based on the interviews. It was also about just the life of the community, living there, going to gatherings, going to things around Muskrat Falls, going to court sometimes when land protectors were going through court, getting to know it kind of outside of just the interview process, but also to know it sort of on a community level, and to sort of incorporate my understanding from my whole experience, not just my technical data. And so I asked very general questions to people about Muskrat Falls. I didn't want it to be specifically about my academic interests or my understanding. I kind of wanted the discussions to take shape based on the person I was talking to and what was meaningful to them. And this is kind of an important thing, I think, in research, because historically, especially working in Indigenous communities, scholars show up and they've got an agenda and they like to hear all this cool stuff that Indigenous people have to say and extract their knowledge and write a report on it, and then they never come back and no one ever hears from them. And you're like, where did that knowledge go, and who's benefiting from it? So that was one way that I kind of wanted to ensure that I was helping to tell the story, I guess, through Labradorians' eyes and not just through my own. And obviously that's not something that's easily remedied. I was born and raised a settler Newfoundlander, and I have ancestors from both Newfoundland and Labrador, and so I think it's important that we talk about that, especially in research, especially in Labrador and in other Indigenous communities, because it's something that's kind of, it has a very problematic history, and it's working its way through. So basically I asked people very general questions, and I wanted to talk to people of all backgrounds who live in Upper Lake Melville. It's a very culturally diverse place. Inuit, settler and Southern Inuit, people who are a little bit of all those things, people who are Labradorians, people who are multiple things. So I think it's important that the research also reflects the diversity of that place. And that I kind of talked about it, like I said, through the perspectives of people who maybe haven't been considered fully, such as Labradorians, such as Indigenous peoples, as we've been talking about for the past 2 days. And like Roberta said yesterday, I thought this was very true. She said, you know, when it comes to the river, we are the experts. And that is 100% true. I can't even tell you how many interviews I did where I was just sitting there like, wow, this person knows so much about the ecology of Lake Melville and the Churchill/Grand River, and that is just incredible. So it's absolutely true. And I might not say much that's totally different from what people have been saying for the past few days, because, you know, Denise, Tracy, all these folks have been getting up and sharing their perspectives. So I don't want to say that I'm speaking for them, or I don't want to, like, you know, take what they're saying or take away from it, but rather just to add to it. And I kind of get the advantage and the privilege of getting to speak to lots of people when they're sort of in an anonymous form, and they can kind of talk a bit more freely than they might be able to when they're speaking in front of an audience. So unlike Jessica, I was unable to get sort of permission to name my participants. I had to keep them anonymous, which I kind of wish I could have named them because what they said was so brilliant, but basically it's going to be mostly anonymous stuff. So now that you know what I did, once I coded all of my data, my interviews were all like several hours long. They were wonderful. There were two main themes that kind of came out. And the biggest, or the first theme I should say, is that there was a lot of discussion around sort of the political and historical dimensions around resource development in Central Labrador and around Muskrat Falls, and how people there feel that there's been a pattern of sort of external imposition onto their territory by whether it be, you know, government actors from Newfoundland or outside companies kind of coming in and using the resources, and local people, or all the local people, are not necessarily consulted. And this was something that people made reference to the Upper Churchill, to when the Hudson's Bay Company was in town, to other resource projects where it was local people were never fully involved and never had full autonomy in terms of how having a say, and it was often external organizations that were sort of doing this. So people talked about that a lot, and that's very interesting, but I can't talk much more about it today because I have to focus on my second theme, which is kind of what I wanted to talk about for this panel, because we heard from Roberta about all of the sort of environmental spin-off issues, and we heard from the two professors about issues around the North Spur. And I kind of wanted to talk about how those risks affect people on a personal level, and what people told me about what this means, because we talk about the issues a lot, but I think it's really important to talk about this isn't really a hypothetical for most people living in Upper Lake Melville. It's actually kind of a lived reality. And while some people are not concerned about these risks, a lot of people are very concerned about the risks, and they have to live with this each and every day. So that's kind of the second thing the second theme was all about people's personal sense of health and safety and well-being, and how Muskrat Falls is kind of, in a lot of different ways, sort of worn on people's well-being and denigrated the well-being of the community. Maybe not for everybody, but for a lot of people in different ways. And so the three sort of main ways that I found this happened were around social and economic changes to the community, fear and stress related to perceived environmental risks, and environmental changes and loss of ways of life. I'm going to talk about the first two kind of briefly, or the first one most briefly, but I just want to make note of how people talked about Muskrat Falls isn't just, you know, I'm worried about methylmercury, I'm worried about the North Spur, I'm worried about my power bills, but it was also things like stepping out your front door and seeing Nalcor trucks all over the community, seeing new people that you've never recognized in the community where you lived there for decades and you used to know everyone by name, and seeing the price of housing going up, families who've got parents got great jobs and they can't afford to rent a house for their family because the prices of rental and housing has gone through the roof. All these little ways that sort of add up and really kind of change the atmosphere that people who've lived there for a long time have to live with. And that sort of over time kind of creates tension and stress for the community. Also, people would tell me anecdotal evidence about things like more expensive drugs coming into the community, violence against women increasing. I don't have any hard data to back that up, but this was sort of the narrative that people were telling me, that they were really concerned about all these things and all these changes that they had witnessed. And also that it kind of brought about tension between interpersonal tension, because you've got some people in the community who perhaps are making good money off the dam working there, some people who are adamantly opposed, some people who are somewhere in between, and some people who have got good jobs there, but then they lose their jobs and then they're in financial stress, and sort of all these different tensions between people who are neighbors and friends and family members. And suddenly, because it's created kind of this inequity in the community, and because some people are uncomfortable with resistance and with people being outspoken because it's sort of a new thing. And whereas other people are doing this because they have such a strong sense that they need to and they have to do this to protect their communities, it just becomes a really interesting and also difficult tension for some people because they've got to reconcile with these sort of already existing fault lines in the community, but this sort of exacerbates it. The second type of, I guess, well-being, can you all hear me? Okay, am I talking too fast? No? Okay, you can wave if I am. The second part, like I said, is fear and stress about environmental risks, and this was largely about the North Spur stability. Some people felt pretty safe. They're like, I'm sure the dam's fine. You know, I would like there to be an emergency response in place. This was last summer, so there wasn't. Now there is. I've got an app on my phone that's basically like, if there's a dam break, we will tell you, or a forest fire, or what have you. But it's just interesting that a lot of people in Happy Valley Goose Bay have that now. And so for some people it was not so serious, but for other people it was very serious. And I think it's really telling that the most frequently mentioned concept across all my interviews, I did 17 interviews, and the term stress was mentioned 50 times. And I think by every participant, if not most of them. Participants explained the entirety of Muskrat Falls as an experience that was riddled with stress, emotions, and strife, either experiencing it in themselves or witnessing it in other people. And so people talked about how surreal it felt to find out that their homes were in the projected flood zone in the result of a flood or of a dam breach, not only because of potential for a dam breach or what have you, but also just because you are altering the way that that river has flowed for hundreds of years. And so that creates change. And so that's why a lot of people in the community of Mud Lake are wary about what happened to them and aren't trustful of this assessment that the dam didn't cause the flood, because they're saying, well, you know what, the dam got put up the year, or started holding back water the year that we got flooded, and we've been here 200 years and it's never happened. So you can understand why people are wary of that and why people feel like they're not really sure. They're very concerned about not just it breaking, but also about just the way that that's going to change the water and how that's going to have multiple effects. One quote from someone who was worried about the North Spur said to me, "The North Spur is a threat. It's a ticking time bomb. Eventually, it may give out. I think it will give out. I know it will. I live in the valley and I live in the flood zone and I'm frightened to death. Most nights I can't sleep. In the middle of the night, if I hear something, it wakes me up and I'm frightened to go back to sleep. I go to bed at night every thinking, am I safe? And it's really hard." For people in Mud Lake, the stress was less about what if and more about what if this happens again? And what if it happens really quickly and not, I mean, it was still pretty sudden when it happened in May of last year, but what if this is more of a flash flood or an extreme event? And because they've already gone through leaving their homes once, it's traumatizing. And I've met some people, especially older people, who are like, I can't, you know, I'm from Mud Lake, I live there, but I've been living in the valley ever since, or been living in Goose Bay ever since, because I don't want to go back there. And I was only able to interview one person from Mud Lake, unfortunately, because I think that their story is very important. And I know some of the land protectors did a series of interviews with them, which are all online if you want to hear more. But this participant said to me, living downstream, everything is a worry. If the water's too low, what's going on upstream? If the water's too high, what's going on upstream? If there's extra debris in the water, what's going on upstream? Is it going to break? And will it break in the daytime when we're all out and about, or in the nighttime when we're asleep? Will it break during the freeze up or in the middle of the winter? What's going to happen in the spring of 2018? You know, there's a sense of eeriness now looming over the community, and it's not a good feeling, because at one point you would always drive into Mud Lake and you would breathe with this feeling of, you're home. But now we drive in and we see garbage and we see houses lifted off their foundations and porch lights still not on because people still can't get home and the vacancies are everywhere. So I just wanted to talk about how that's not just an issue of what if, but it's also an ongoing stress for people. And the last theme, which I think is one of them, is important and is very similar to kind of what Jessica talked about this morning, is around environmental change and fears about losing ways of life in the region. Excuse me. The most obvious health impact when we look at it from that lens of the Muskrat Falls project would be the potential increase in methyl mercury. That's sort of the thing that sounds very scary, and that's sort of like an obvious health issue. If people end up continuing to consume wildlife from the Lake Melville region, at the time of fieldwork, it wasn't really known if this was going to become a reality or not. And as we know, the provincial government currently has the independent expert advisory committee's recommendations on methylmercury mitigation, and we're not sure what's going to come of that yet. At the time, people weren't sure if people would ever come to be contaminated with methylmercury or be poisoned by methylmercury, or if people would change their dietary habits, it would never occur, or if it would never occur in the ecosystem. Things were still a little bit up in the air. But even if methylmercury never becomes an issue physically or is never measurable in people's bodies, the worry and fear associated with the potential risk was already real. It already is real and has already had an effect on people's health and well-being in terms of worrying about the future of their communities and their future to eat their wild foods. The fear of being poisoned by methylmercury was in front of many people's minds. The alternative would be to give up consuming country foods or consuming them less. Some people talked about, if this comes to be a reality, having to make really difficult hypothetical choices, or scenarios such as maybe deciding to feed non-country foods to young people who are more susceptible, and maybe allowing older people or oneself to continue eating the foods because you don't want to give them up, and it's really expensive to not be able to have your country foods, but you don't want to subject mothers and young children to it. So these are really tough choices that people are worried that they're going to have to make. Having to balance the advantage of the affordability and the availability of country food while also not bringing harm to your loved ones. But losing country foods is about a lot more than feeding one's family or the economic. Participants explained that if they were to lose this, it would have serious detrimental effects to their personal health and well-being, and would be a cultural loss. Inuit, Southern Inuit, Innu, and other Labradorians consume country foods as part of their traditional land-based subsistence harvesting practices, and this includes hunting, fishing, sealing, trapping, berry picking. And research has demonstrated that when Indigenous communities transition away from their country and traditional foods, it's been associated with physical and mental health issues for both Innu and Inuit in Labrador, and also lots of communities across Canada. And we've seen in both Grassy Narrows First Nation and White Dog Independent Nations Reserve, both in Ontario, that when in fact mercury comes to contaminate people, there's very, very severe physical, psychological, and social health consequences, which are quite severe and inhumane. But even if it's not necessarily a reality or a measurable reality, it's been shown that Indigenous communities have increased rates of things like cancer, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and others when they transition from wild foods, and that when environmental change or industry causes doubt in people's waters and in their environments, the fear and stress that comes along with that causes severe psychological distress as well. So it's not just about whether or not people are getting contaminated, it's about a much bigger picture than that. Naria talked about this morning when she talked about how often when we look at the patterns of where environmental risks are taken in Canada around large projects, it's often Indigenous communities or other marginalized communities, and this is true across the world. All the cases I read of major hydro dams, when there's issues with them, which there usually is, it's always Indigenous communities, almost always, because they live so closely to the land and because they often live in remote areas that are impacted and that are either told you have to leave, or that see their fishing or their ways of life completely changed, or have, so in some cases, literally just been standing, and then a reservoir just starts flooding and they've just got to leave their communities. Like, that's happened all over the world. So participants explained to me that hunting and fishing and being on the land is an integral part of their way of life. It connects them to the land and the waters, and also gives them a closer connection to the wildlife and other living things, to each other and to their ancestors. Living off the land is a way of life for people of all backgrounds in Labrador, both Indigenous and settler. And when this is compromised, their cultures are compromised. As one Inuk mother said, "I want my children to have their culture. I just want them to have healthy waters, healthy food, to have a healthy future, and not to be living in the pollution this project will leave behind. Everything is at stake. Our lives, our culture is at stake, our food chain is at stake." Other participants, particularly those who identify themselves as Inuit or as Indigenous, felt that the Muskrat Falls project was akin to losing the river or killing the river or poisoning the river, because to see the river changed in that way, to see the ecosystem change in that way, was disrupting and cutting off all the life that depends on it, and also the peoples and cultures that depend on it. I've got a couple of quotes that talk about this. I can find them. I'm going to get lost now. How am I doing for time? Am I taking too much time? Okay. One participant said, I think for me, it's the whole impact of it. I just have in my mind's eye just the changing of that river's course. Some people warn that we shouldn't anthropomorphize our physical landmarks, but to me, that water in that river is a living being. To me, it's painful that its course would be altered in a man-made fashion, and I really disagree with that. Another person said, that river holds an incredible amount of sacredness and history and culture. It's a powerful river, and if you have time to be on it or next to it. The first time I remember I went to Muskrat Falls, it was tangible. I had never before had a feeling where the spiritual presence was so strong. So this kind of shows how important Muskrat Falls and the river are to people living there. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I don't want to keep you too much longer. But so it's not just about whether or not the North Spur fails, whether or not we see people with elevated methylmercury risks. It's about protecting this environment and these cultures and this way of life for future generations. And this is something that is incorporated into a lot of Indigenous worldviews and beliefs. Deborah McGregor explains this when she says, Indigenous views of development are based not on taking, which is what we do with often with natural resource projects, but on giving. Indigenous people ask themselves what they can give to the environment and their relationship with it. The idea of sustaining, maintaining, and enhancing relations with all of creation is of the utmost importance from the Indigenous point of view. And as Neria said this morning, and a few of us have said, it's kind of very obvious that the proponents of the project don't really understand that it is such a vital part of people's being, and they don't really understand that need for protection. Rather, the land is sort of used as a resource and is something that's just there for the taking. So in the context of Muskrat Falls, project proponents maintain that no one will be poisoned by methylmercury, implying that either the projected effects are inaccurate or that if they occur, they'll be mitigated against through consumption advisories or something of the like. This simplistic understanding dichotomizes the issue into either contaminated or not, and does not fully encapsulate the way in which the potential contamination of country foods already has and will affect people living in the region, and the ability of future generations to continue living in relation to the land and the water as they and their ancestors have for years. Proponents have also said that the North Spur is safe, but not all people in Labrador trust this information, and the fear that they are experiencing is very real. Labradorians are told that the dam is a good thing, that it will create jobs, but then they see inequity in income between peoples and their communities and how the cost of living and the social fabric of their community has changed over time. The compounding effect of all these factors, the changing environment, feelings of oppression from being silenced through the court system or through interpersonal conflict, the fear of flooding and of changes of the river, the sort of sense of ecological grief to lend from Dr. Ashley Console and her colleagues in Rigolette and elsewhere, and Jessica mentioned this morning, this concept around feeling this grief and the stress, all of these factors kind of combined, and they sort of affect people in individual and collective ways that undermine their well-being. For some, this was experienced as a collective community trauma, one that was articulated through the framing of colonialism or other forms of oppression and injustice. The distress brought about by Muskrat Falls was explained in reference to other forms of colonial oppression for peoples in the region, past resource developments, the legacy of the Hudson's Bay Company, residential schools, erosions onto their culture, and so on. So the cultural loss of this part of the river speaks to how it's experienced as colonialism. And one of the participants said this. He said, that's one of the biggest impacts that's going unmeasured and unaddressed. You've got a whole community that's really divided because there are 400 or 500 people that have employment there and they need the work, but maybe some of them themselves are conflicted if they are Indigenous and they might have different feelings on the project. Just because they're working there doesn't mean that they like that they're working there. And I think that's a big impact that's going unaddressed. If you get into Indigenous politics, it's kind of like another wave of colonialism. And I think that you'll see that a lot of people will have trauma because of this that will be passed on. And it's really going unacknowledged. I think that's one for me personally, and I think of it as a community. And it might sound sort of extreme to relate a hydro dam to trauma, but this has been documented in other cases in northern Manitoba. Martin Loney, I think it's Martin, has written about Grand Rapids and a few other communities and how it has affected those communities in a traumatic way. He provides a definition by Erickson that says, by collective trauma, I mean a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damage the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of communality. This collective trauma works its way slowly and even insidiously into awareness of those who suffer from it. So it does not have the quality of suddenness normally associated with trauma, but over time these changes people know this and people feel this, and Labradorians explain this to me as they experience it. So even if people didn't necessarily articulate it in terms of Indigenous rights or Indigenous resistance, which a lot of people have, and a lot of people in Labrador have mobilized and have educated themselves. We see it through Tracy's talk this morning. We see it with Roberta's research. Even if people don't use those mainstream ways of discussing what they're feeling and what they're going through, a lot of Labradorians still know that experience. While people talk about their specific rights to specific nations, they also talk about unity and wanting to protect the land for all people. And even if they don't know how to talk about it in those sort of formalized academic terms, they experience it and they tell me how they feel. This feeling of oppression, this feeling that they're not being listened to, this feeling that people want to take away from what they have, their cultures and their communities. People spoke of wanting to see their peoples be able to live on the land and on the river in their own way, on their own terms, as they have for time immemorial. So what I want to close off with saying is, I think that in Newfoundland especially, it kind of gets lost because we're thinking, oh, like they made that agreement in October a couple years ago, there's no such thing as methylmercury, it's all good, or oh, the stuff at the North Spur, I'm sure it's fine, like that's a bunch of whatever. I think we need to get away from like saying, oh, it is an issue or it's not, and instead we need to also be looking at, while all of this doubt and uncertainty is ongoing, and while these changes are ongoing, and while the dam is changing that landscape and that ecosystem, people are experiencing distress and fear and trauma and uncertainty around all of that. And so I think we need to keep in mind when we're talking about it that that's very real for people. I think that people think that it's not an issue anymore, or that it's not serious unless we have very measurable methylmercury effects down the road. But I just wanted to say that I'm very happy and privileged to get to talk to the people that I did. I wish I could just play all their interviews for you because they're much more interesting than me talking, but it is a very real phenomenon. The people in Labrador I talked to were so inspiring with their personal histories of activism, protecting their land, of their culture, and I think we would all like to see that maybe preserved. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker on this panel, will be the last speaker for this panel, is Kyla Bruff. Kyla is a PhD candidate in the Department of Philosophy here at Memorial. Her work investigates the metaphysical commitments of political positions, particularly in classical German philosophy. Kyla.
So when I want the slides changed, do I just point? Okay, great. So, hello. Since this panel is about living under threat in Labrador, before I say anything at all today, I want to come clean. Before the public symposium on Muskrat Falls that I helped organize in Happy Valley Goose Bay back in February, I had never been to Labrador. I had never heard that ever so particular crunch of the packed snow under my feet while walking. I had never gone dog sledding in sunny, bright winter. I had never experienced my breath instantly freezing on the balaclava while skidooing on Lake Melville, and I had never seen the Mealy Mountains. Clearly, I was missing out. Labrador is a truly special place. But it's not just because of its impressive environment and the feeling of freedom that one has while exploring its vastness with locals in winter. Given what I just said, of course, it's not my place to stand here and speak about the rich cultural life of the Inuit and Innu of Labrador. We have so many incredible people here who've been sharing details about their history, traditional practices, ways of life, struggles, and fears that they now face on their communities over the past 2 days. Jessica Penny, of course, did an amazing job giving us a window on some of those perspectives earlier, as well as Denise Cole and others, so thank you for that. On that note, I do want to remark that during our few days in Labrador, local people, some of whom were here with us today, were unbelievably gracious and willing as they shared their stories, including their pain, with us in both the formal setting of the February Muskrat Falls Public Symposium and in informal settings. I mean, in their homes, on skidoos, in cabins, on dog sleds, in trucks. I will get to the details of this big Muskrat Symposium in February in a moment, but what I've told you so far is just a very modest inkling of an indication of the possibility of intertwining stories and narratives. You see, up until February of last year, I had largely identified as a primary theoretical, often isolated philosophical thinker from Newfoundland. and I now identify as an engaged public philosophical thinker from Newfoundland and Labrador. The stories I was personally told in Labrador about how Muskrat Falls changed local lives, along with the experience of being with these people in their homes, changed how I identify with our province and therefore how little old me tells my story. I began thinking about how much the dominant narrative history of Newfoundland has so often neglected Labrador, with the exception of moments in which money could be made. During our time in Labrador, many people spoke, of course, of how ignored they felt in the context of the political decisions made here in St. John's. And again, Jessica Penny reiterated some of this today with the words of Elgar Davis as he expressed his feelings that being inferior was, quote, I think from your presentation, always the situation with Labradorians anyway. See, the narratives that we listen to and adopt shape who we are. Our identities, argued philosopher Paul Ricoeur, are never completely stable and totally incoherent. Instead, we're always in this in-between of actively interpreting our own experiences in ways that make sense in our own stories. So the stories which were shared in February at the Muskrat Falls Symposium, and which we've been hearing since yesterday here, are testament to the grave consequences that the Muskrat Falls Electric Project has been having on how the people of Newfoundland and Labrador identify. It also affects who they can be in the future, who their kids will be, and what cultural practices will be passed on to future generations. So during our time in Labrador, are we too far ahead? Yeah, there we go, thanks. So during our time in Labrador, we were fortunate, I'm sure a lot of people know who this is, to spend a few hours with Mina Campbell, who communicated to us clearly and effectively what the loss of the seal hunt would mean for her, and how this project is directly affecting the cultural practices that she can pass down to her nieces. She expressed how the project is going to render the shared bonding experience surrounding the seal hunt impossible. So to make things clear, this project is directly affecting who Mina and her nieces will be, and it is also taking something from her possibility to relate to them. And this is not something that can be substituted by monetary compensation. I mean, it's obvious. Everybody here, I think, asked the same question, whether the government of Newfoundland and Labrador and Nalcor really take this point about the possibility of subsidy clearly, at all, seriously at all. So as Roberta Benefiel just said, are people and their culture expendable for a hydroelectric project? So I hope you're not going to be angry at me for making this kind of comparison that is an inadequate comparison. But I was thinking about it the other day when speaking to a friend about this issue. Would any of those people who defended compensation as a solution here accept having their family Christmas taken away from them by a dominant institution that's occupying their home? And I know it's not adequate. I know it contains no analogous elements to subsistence practices, to relationships to the land, to a history of cultural oppression, which are all elements that the Inuit and Innu are facing as a result of Muskrat Falls. But I truly believe that to propose monetary compensation for a loss of tradition and culture is brash, it's out of touch, and it is further evidence of the Nalcor and government narrative that everything, absolutely everything, including culture and university expertise, can be translated into a dollar value. Please change the slide. Yeah, so here we go. So I'm here in my capacity today as co-director of the Newfoundland and Labrador MPO for New Earth, which we call FANE. And For New Earth in February of this year came together with the Royal Society of Canada, the Labrador Institute, and MUN's Department of Philosophy to put off what I've been describing as the February Muskrat Falls Symposium. So FANE has served as a channel to bring academics and community members together on ecological and political issues facing the province, with Muskrat Falls being our primary focus over the past year. The 3 co-directors. So the organization, which I contributed actually to founding with my PhD supervisor who's here, Sean McGraw, who's also there, has become extremely personally important to me as a young person who is still living here in the so-called end times. It has been an avenue for me to develop a public voice and to establish how I think philosophy can speak practically to shady politics, notably in the form of parsing the lines of argumentation being employed by contingents of the populations whose backgrounds, interests, and even uses of language are just on completely different planes. It also allows me an opportunity to provide critical commentary, which is, in my opinion, an integral part of philosophy and the philosophical tradition. But on a more theoretical level, I think philosophy also has much to offer with this narrative that I put forth to you at the beginning of the talk about narrative identity, which can be interpreted in terms of how we develop a sense of self in relationship to our time and in relationship to the dominant narratives that shape our time. Furthermore, the philosophy of history, another branch of philosophy, which I'll get to at the end of this talk, helps us reflect on those collective dominant narratives and political myths. So to ask questions like what guiding principles and collective feelings have been at work, often irrationally at work, in shaping our political future. Slide, please. So, as I mentioned, I was one of the co-organizers of this February Muskrat Fall Symposium. I think it's good to just say a word about it so I can remind you that it happened and that, you know, we keep having these events and that there's a meaning and a reason to do it. So the structure of this symposium, which you can see on the slide, was largely put forth by Ashley Consulo of the Labrador Institute, and it was unique. So it included a half day of public talks, perhaps not so unique, but then a full day of interpersonal sharing, which was called a World Cafe. So, you know, it was a rare event where academics who, myself included, never seemed to stop talking, actually stopped talking or spoke sensitively and selectively while hearing the stories of the local people. Furthermore, at the end of the event, we began drafting a resolution for an independent inquiry into the North Spur and a water monitoring program. And this, of course, follows the recommendations that we just saw of Stig and Lennart. So here's some pictures from the first day of the symposium. I'm sure you recognize some of those faces. It began with a series of sort of informative public talks by David Barty, Kelly Vodden, Stephen Crocker, and Marina Biasuti Brown of the Independent Expert Advisory Committee. And this, I think, provided a kind of opening context for the facts and for people of the fact story for the people attending for the rest of the event. And so the day ended with a keynote address from the man that you see on the right, Jerry Bannister, whose work on historical narratives, political culture, collective memory, and nationalism in Newfoundland and Labrador is something that, in my opinion, we should really revisit again and again. He is much more qualified than me to express the province's narrative and collective myths insofar as they have contributed to the instantiation of Muskrat Falls. So I would say that you should look at some of Jerry's work, right? I find that it really forces us to face that Danny quote that was blaring at us in the Liz Solo video yesterday, where he says, "This is called progress." So this is in philosophy, we would analyze it as a teleological myth towards progress, right? There's no possibility it can fail. It's progress. We move from a state of suffering and a state of shambled sort of asunder beings into one mega project that delivers us from all of the problems that we ever had. And you know, oil issues, collapse of the fishery, that's just part of that collective struggling. And what happens in the end is this delivery, almost a theological moment where everybody is in a community of perfect prosperity. This is what Jerry's work, in my view, addresses. You can actually hear Jerry give a talk in town in February, actually, at the Marine Institute called The Return of History, Newfoundland and Labrador, after the oil boom and the hydro bust. Change the slide, please. So the World Cafe format, which you can see here, I think the image is kind of effective, was something I was totally unfamiliar with, actually, before this event. But it was an incredibly effective way to both share and, above all, listen and absorb. So the whole idea of it was to create dialogue, learning, sharing, and all of this to sort of give people an opportunity to listen and understand mostly local people of the region. Also some researchers, but it was primarily locals. So just to give you a very quick rundown on who the World Cafe hosts were. So the hosts of these tables who spoke to the other people as we all rotated. They literally like hosted us at a table about their experiences, about what they know, and shared it with small groups. So the hosts, there was Tracy Doherty, obviously, of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Marjorie Flowers on traditional food contamination, Melissa Best on Mud Lake flooding, Emily Philpott here on resistance and activism, Scott Nielsen on intangible cultural assets, Craig Chalk on the North Spur, Sylvia Moore on land learning, Jim Learning on justice and colonial oppression, Matt Pike on Gull Island, Roberta Benefiel on emerging resistance networks, Ernie McLean on business impacts, and Jacinda Beals on the mental and emotional impacts. So during these conversations, I said that the hosts at the separate tables faced the participants and spoke to them about what is going on for them. And the participants also got a sense of this and cried, learned, and really got to partake in discussions about what is happening existentially, we could say, to somebody else. So it was conducted in a flexible conversation style, and everyone could contribute how they felt as they wished. It was a totally different form of sharing information from the formal academic conference that I am used to. So slide, please. So then, as you can see here, on March 1st, we partnered up with Dave Vardy and Jim Learning to have a truly publicly accessible event at the Peter Easton Pub. The meeting was called What's Next for Muskrat Falls, and surprisingly, the place was actually packed. This was kind of put together last minute to bring what we had done in Labrador to a St. John's audience who was genuinely interested. We didn't need a booking. We just went to the Peter E., had the event. There were a lot of people there, and Dave's work, of course, gave us hope that we can slowly start to reclaim democratic institutions together. He also notably described Muskrat Falls at this event as a Ponzi scheme and emphasized a criminal event of Muskrat Falls that needs to be pursued. Jim Learning emphasized the point about the actual lives of Labradorians being left out of the dominant narrative and argued that Labradorians provincially elect only to be owned and not to be represented. So that was just my rundown to give you an idea that things did happen, things are happening, For New Earth is involved in those things that are happening. But am I the only one who asks myself from time to time, what's the point of all these events? Why do we keep talking and having meetings? Well, I have some reasons, I think. If I haven't made it clear enough, I think at these events, a lot of us begin to listen to the stories and pain of others who suffer under the dominant narrative of this mega project. We can then, in turn, incorporate their realities into stories we tell about who we are as Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. I think a lot of us feel that feeling today about what we learned from Denise Cole. So through these public events, we also have a unique experience to hear the narratives of those affected, but also an opportunity to learn facts and to learn the opinions of the experts who have actually done the work to find out what the numbers behind Muskrat Falls are. So I'm thinking of the work of Des Sullivan and Dave Vardy and Jim Feehan, who not only write voluminous amounts and articles and things that like I try to wade through and then sometimes I don't make it. They are willing to do a second step to come out and say it to me. They're saying it to me and arming me to go into the world and defend this position that for different people in the room perhaps was originally based on something else, a conviction, a care for others, a personal suffering, something they learned at a history lecture. We all have different reasons why and how we got involved in this. But as we continue to be involved, I think that it's important that at these events we kind of acquire the armor and equipment to go out. And I want to thank you, Des and Jim and Dave, for providing us with that. So after these symposium public talks, it's my view that we can incorporate our impressions and knowledge of these figures and truths into our own methods of discerning how to publicly express just how damaging this project has been and how we feel about our own political culture. So in short, I think to know all of the social and political impact of this project and how to respond is something that cannot be established in a single meeting or day, but rather we need to meet more than once. We need to keep doing this because artists, philosophers, social scientists in particular need time to respond. And the trauma of the people living in Labrador is something that has been progressively revealed and communicated to us and continues to be so as we have things like this event. So I want to return for a second to what I think philosophy and academia can do on the Muskrat Falls front and how I think those of us trained in philosophy can play a positive role in the public discussion. So this photo is of Sean from For New Earth at Stan Marshall's infamous visit to Munn in February of 2018. Do you remember this visit where Stan Marshall said, no one's going to be poisoned, the North Spur won't collapse, and most brazenly, I can't control if people sleep in fear with life jackets under their beds. So how could philosophy respond to this? I mean, first of all, the oldest lesson from Plato's Republic is that philosophers and those in government are servants. They serve the public. They do a service. And do we think that Stan Marshall and Nalcor and even the government of Newfoundland and Labrador are serving? Do they make the impression of being servants? And you know, this is not entirely my line. If you remember at this event, those of you who saw it or were there, Mike Clare of the Harris Center got up and reminded Stan Marshall of that in his face. He said, you should serve the province. You are a servant. You're not a CEO of some multi-million-dollar corporation that you built on your own or some capitalist machine. You're a servant. And on top of that, I would like to draw our remarks to, or our attention to some of Sean's philosophical remarks as he framed the discussion of Muskrat Falls in this moment in a very particular way. So he said, what's going on is kind of a battle of existential concerns and corporate concerns. And as philosophers, as I mentioned earlier, I think we can work to sort out those concerns and those lines of argumentation to see why sometimes you have the feeling of being duped, right? You're like, the premises and the conclusions follow argumentatively, like of what this manager of this corporation is saying, forget servant, but it's not touching me. It's not reaching the concerns of the people involved. So if it logically stands, this is not the criteria for it to be true to us, despite the truth in the premises. So sorry, that was a bit of like formal logic speak, but that's what's going on. There are lines of argumentation that may make sense, but how do those lines of argumentation meet? How do they treat the concerns of people involved? How do they address the philosophical questions? What is the public good? What do people want? What is the value of security in human life? And so just to clue up with what happened here is there was a discussion about whether Muskrat Falls is a disaster for the democratic process in Newfoundland and Labrador. As Sean was asking, how would we restore our faith in Newfoundland and Labrador after this? Getting to the theme of my talk, which is going forward after Muskrat Falls. How can we see our future? So philosophy can be mobilized in this context of democracy, and specifically what it means to say that we have a democratic deficit. And Roberta, I think you just raised some of those remarks in a really poignant way when you said, in our democratic climate, how do the silent majority and grassroots activists fit into this? Okay, the slide, please. So sorry that there is one big philosophical quote, but I wouldn't be a boring, recovering, reclusive academic if I didn't give you one quote. But this quote is from a very important post-World War II Holocaust-reflecting philosopher, Jewish philosopher named Max Horkheimer, critical theorist. And basically, the gist of this quote is that we have an imperative, a moral imperative, to listen to the voices of those who have suffered and translate them into language that can be heard and that will be heard. So I'm going to read it. The real individuals of our time are the martyrs who have gone through the infernos of suffering and degradation in their resistance to conquest and oppression, not the inflated personalities of popular culture, the conventional dignitaries. These unsung heroes consciously expose their existence as individuals to the terroristic annihilation that others undergo unconsciously through the social process. The anonymous martyrs of the concentration camps are the symbols of the humanity that is striving to be born. The task of philosophy is to translate what they have done into a language that will be heard, even though their finite voices have been silenced by tyranny. And I would argue that many of the voices that we've started to hear from people living in Labrador are finite voices that have been silenced by tyranny and people who have undergone this sort of suffering that Horkheimer is alluding to. So Horkheimer is famous actually for this thematization of suffering, particularly also in theological circles. And he argues that suffering can never be encompassed into a single dominant narrative. In short, language is never adequate to suffering. There's always an element of suffering or trauma or damage that cannot be reasoned away, no matter how many lines of argumentation that we have. And this has been touched on, of course, a few times in the symposium so far. Gerald Vanderling talked about this relation of art to the question of how we can stop being complicit in the suffering of others. In the discussion yesterday, neutrality and apathy in the face of oppression were scrutinized as expressing a complicity with this Danny Williams bogus progress narrative. And finally, Tracy pointed out here today earlier that the imperative is to listen. I think you said listen to the stories that are coming out. And I'm with you on that. So just my final slide. I have a couple of questions and things we can think about going forward. So these are just some questions in the context of the philosophy of history of Muskrat Falls that could be fruitful for discussion. So I wrote more of the answers in a big question, but I've put them in smaller questions in my talk. So what new ways of engaging with collective history, moments of societal change, and community dynamics might better enable Newfoundlanders and Labradorians to shape the future direction of the province in the wake of the Muskrat Falls controversy and its associated impacts? It's impossible for the people of the province to unite as some sort of large community, which nevertheless contains diverse self-governing subcommunities, to make a decision, to decide how the majority of the populace wants to move forward on this issue. It is clear that we are at a critical moment of possible change in Newfoundland and Labrador's trajectory. And while it is impossible to clearly answer these questions here today in a single session, we can begin by criticizing what I called the teleology or direction of Newfoundland and Labrador politics. We can identify how harmful the nationalist narrative of us in Newfoundland versus them has truly been, and we can dismantle the political myth that the collective suffering of the mostly settler population Newfoundland and Labrador will one day be resolved by a massive economic, industrial, fix-all solution. So I'm of course touching here on what Neria Aylward said this morning regarding the trope that we talk as if we are the ones who are put down. Furthermore, we can continue to truly listen to the stories of those who've been directly affected by Muskrat Falls, and also of those activists who have been historically silenced or even right now are blacklisted, and sensitively incorporate their perspectives into our own narratives as people who live here. And finally, perhaps we can begin to rewrite the narrative of this province in a very modest way. Modesty, I would argue, something that Newfoundlanders and Labradorians have more to learn about. Modesty, a way that we can move towards empowered communities, focusing on democratic institutions that work and check and speak to power. And finally, which would actually encourage and give young people, young, modest innovators, a reason to stay in this province. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyla. Thank you to all of our presenters. Folks, we are now very behind schedule. And so we are thinking that maybe we will try to incorporate questions for this session, maybe into next session, so that we have enough time to have a break before the coming session. Seem reasonable? Yeah? You can also ask folks questions here. You want to say something?
No, when you're done.
When I'm done? Yeah. Okay. All right. So I would suggest now we have a break, have coffee, all that kind of stuff. We come back, there's another great session on democracy, access to information. Justin Brake, Rob Whittaker will be here. Uncle Gnarly will be here, as promised to be extra gnarly today. And Greg Hewlett will be here. So please have a coffee, come back in about 15 minutes or so, and there'll be opportunities to talk to these folks in the coffee. After that, Lennart and Stig, you're out there online somewhere. I'm sorry we can't ask you questions now, but we will. Thank you to everyone. Thanks a lot.